John Radcliffe, a man whose face is instantly recognizable in certain circles but unremarkable to most, walked into the hospital wearing his signature MAGA hat. The red cap perched firmly on his head seemed to exude confidence, though the man beneath it looked pale and uneasy. He was here for a routine procedure, a minor surgery he had scheduled weeks in advance. It was supposed to be uneventful. The hospital lobby bustled with activity, the hum of conversations blending with the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the occasional crackle of the intercom. As John approached the reception desk, he noticed the receptionist's eyes flick briefly to his hat. A flicker of something, disdain perhaps, crossed her face before she plastered on a professional smile. "Mr. Radcliffe," she said, her voice crisp but polite. "You're here for the outpatient procedure?" John nodded, adjusting the brim of his hat. "That's right. Shouldn't take long, I was told." The receptionist tapped away at her keyboard, handing him a clipboard to fill out some last-minute paperwork. "The nurse will call you shortly," she said, already turning her attention to the next patient. John took a seat in the waiting area, pulling his phone out to pass the time. A few feet away, he noticed a cluster of staff whispering, their eyes darting to him now and then. He tried to ignore it, but their poorly hidden smirks and quiet laughter left him feeling distinctly unwelcome. Ju, a surgeon with a reputation meanwhile, Dr. Samuel Everett, the lead surgeon scheduled to perform John's procedure, was in his office reviewing the morning's cases. Renowned for his precision in the operating room, Dr. Everett was equally known for his sharp tongue and unyielding opinions outside of it. He prided himself on his professionalism, but those who worked closely with him knew his views were often uncompromising, especially when it came to politics. "Who's next?" he asked his assistant, not looking up from the patient chart in his hands. "Hurrah! Miss Brown, Barbara says around away northern Canterbury." He asked his assistant, not looking. "John Radcliffe," the assistant replied. "Outpatient gallbladder removal. Shouldn't take more than an hour." Dr. Everett nodded absently, flipping through the chart. Then his assistant added, almost offhandedly, "Oh, and he's wearing one of those MAGA hats." That got the doctor's attention. His head snapped up, eyebrows knitting together in an expression of mild disgust. "Really?" he said, leaning back in his chair. "Oh." The assistant, sensing a rant incoming, busied herself with the clipboard. "Just thought you should know," she muttered before quickly leaving the room. Dr. Everett sighed, setting the chart down. "This should be interesting," he murmured to himself, his tone dripping with irony. Oh, the first encounter. John was eventually called back by a nurse who escorted him to a pre-op room. He changed into a hospital gown, tucking his hat neatly into his belongings bag, and sat on the edge of the bed. His nerves began to settle as the nurse took his vitals and walked him through the procedure one last time. Then, the door opened, and Dr. Everett stepped in. His white coat seemed to billow behind him as he strode into the room with an air of authority. But the moment his eyes landed on John, they narrowed slightly. John felt the change in the room's atmosphere almost immediately. "Mr. Radcliffe," Dr. Everett said, his tone clipped. "I see we're ready to proceed." John nodded, offering a small smile. "That's right, Doc. I'm ready when you are." "Ah?" Dr. Everett glanced at the belongings bag, where the unmistakable red cap poked out slightly. His jaw tightened, and he hesitated for just a fraction of a second. It was subtle, but John caught it. "Is there a problem?" John asked, his voice calm but edged with curiosity. The doctor shook his head briskly. "Not at all," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Let's just make sure everything is in order before we proceed." The refusal minutes later, Dr. Everett stepped out of the room and into the hallway, calling for the nurse. "I'm not doing it," he said flatly, his voice low but firm. The nurse looked at him in disbelief. "Excuse me?" "Excuse me, I'm not operating on him," he repeated, his expression steely. "Find someone else to take the case." The nurse hesitated, clearly unsure how to respond. "Dr. Everett, with all due respect, this is highly unprofessional. He's already prepped, and you're the attending." Dr. Everett's eyes flashed with annoyance. "I have the right to refuse any patient, and I'm exercising that right now. End of discussion. John sat in the pre-op room, fiddling with the edge of the hospital gown. Minutes had turned into what felt like hours, and no one had come back to update him. The nurse who had been so attentive earlier now seemed to have disappeared entirely. He glanced at the wall clock, his unease growing. "What's taking so long?" he muttered to himself. When a different nurse finally walked in, she was visibly uncomfortable. Her eyes avoided his as she fumbled with the chart in her hands. "Mr. Radcliffe," she began, her voice strained. "There's been a delay. We're working on assigning another surgeon for your procedure." John blinked, his confusion quickly giving way to frustration. "Another surgeon? Why? What happened to the one I was assigned?" The nurse hesitated, searching for the right words. "Dr. Everett. He's unavailable." John frowned, leaning forward slightly. "Unavailable? What does that mean? He was just here." The nurse avoided his gaze. "It's a scheduling issue," she said finally, though her tone lacked conviction. "I assure you we'll find someone else just as capable." John wasn't buying it. "This is about my hat, isn't it?" His voice was calm, but there was steel behind it. "Be honest with me." The nurse froze, her face betraying her discomfort. I'm not sure, sir. Please try to relax. We'll sort this out." She quickly exited the room, leaving John alone with his suspicions. "You," the whispered conversation in the hallway. Dr. Everett was pacing back and forth, the nurse from earlier trailing behind him. "You can't just walk away from a patient," she whispered urgently. "This isn't some random walk-in. It's a scheduled procedure." Dr. Everett stopped, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Look, I'm not going to pretend like I'm okay with this. I refuse to perform surgery on someone who aligns themselves with what that hat represents." The nurse stared at him in disbelief. "Dr. Everett, you're letting personal biases interfere with your duty as a physician. This could have serious consequences." He shook his head. "I have my principles, and I'm not compromising them." "Your principles," the nurse hissed. "What about the Hippocratic Oath? What about the fact that this man is trusting you with his life?" Dr. Everett crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "There are other surgeons in this hospital. Someone else can do it. My conscience is clear." With the patient's authority revealed back in the pre-op room, John's phone buzzed with a text from his assistant, David. Curious, he opened it and found a single message. "Shui, everything okay? Do you need me to call AR? Guide on you or?" John stared at the screen for a moment, considering his next move. He knew he wasn't an ordinary patient, but he had chosen not to leverage his position thus far. However, the growing sense of injustice gnawed at him. Taking a deep breath, he replied, "Call HR and legal." I think it's time they got involved. Moments later, the pre-op room door opened again, this time revealing the hospital's chief of staff, Dr. Miriam Keller. A composed and authoritative woman, Dr. Keller rarely involved herself in day-to-day operations unless something serious was happening. "Mr. Radcliffe," she said warmly, stepping inside. "I understand there's been some confusion about your procedure. I'm here to assure you that we're handling it." John looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Confusion? That's an interesting word for it. What I want to know is why my original surgeon refused to treat me." Dr. Keller hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Dr. Everett expressed some concerns about the case, but we've already assigned another highly skilled surgeon to step in." John's eyes narrowed. Concerns about the case, or concerns about my hat? Dr. Keller stiffened slightly, her professional demeanor faltering for just a second. "I understand you're upset, but I assure you, our priority is your health and safety." "Cut the nonsense," John said firmly, his voice calm but commanding. "I know exactly what this is about. And you should know something too. I'm not just a patient. I own this hospital." The bombshell lands. Dr. Keller's face froze, her professional smile vanishing. I wasn't aware of that," she said carefully. John nodded, folding his arms. "Well, now you are. And let me be clear, This isn't just a personal issue anymore. It's a professional one. I expect an explanation for this unprofessional behavior, and I expect it now." Before Dr. Keller could respond, John's assistant David walked into the room, phone in hand. "HR is on the line," he announced. "And they're asking if you'd like to escalate this." John smiled faintly, though his eyes remained sharp. "Let's see if they come to me with an explanation first. If not, we escalate." Dr. Everett had returned to his office, confident in his decision to step away from the case. He felt justified in his refusal, believing his moral stance outweighed the need to cater to every patient. Yet, his confidence wavered as he heard hurried footsteps approaching. The door burst open, and Dr. Miriam Keller entered, her usual calm now replaced with barely controlled frustration. "Samuel, we need to talk," she said sharply. Dr. Everett raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "Let me guess. This is about Mr. Radcliffe." Dr. Keller closed the door behind her, lowering her voice. "It's not just about Mr. Radcliffe. It's about the future of your career, this hospital's reputation, and the firestorm you've just lit." He frowned. "A bit dramatic, don't you think? I exercised my right to refuse a patient." Dr. Keller crossed her arms, fixing him with a steely glare. "Do you have any idea who he is?" Dr. Everett shrugged. "A man with questionable taste in hats? He owner of this hospital?" Dr. Keller snapped. The words hit Dr. Everett like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he simply stared at her, his mind racing. "The owner?" he repeated, his voice lower now, tinged with disbelief. "Yes, and he's furious. HR is already involved, and he's well within his rights to escalate this to the board." Dr. Everett's composure faltered. "You can't be serious. All of this because I wouldn't operate on one man?" Dr. Keller stepped closer, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "This isn't just one man, Samuel. It's about ethics, professionalism, and respect. Do you think the board will side with you over him? He signs their checks. John takes action." In his pre-op room, John paced back and forth, his earlier frustration now simmering into controlled determination. His assistant David was on the phone with the hospital's HR director, calmly relaying the events. "I need this addressed immediately," John said firmly after David handed him the phone. "This isn't just about me. It's about the culture of this hospital. If one surgeon feels justified in refusing a patient for personal reasons, what does that say about the rest of the staff?" The HR director's voice crackled through the line. "Mr. Radcliffe, I assure you, this is not reflective of our policies. We take these matters very seriously, and Dr. Everett's actions will be reviewed thoroughly." John smiled faintly, though his tone remained stern. "Good, because if this isn't resolved appropriately, I'll be taking it directly to the board, and the media, if necessary." With the confrontation not long after, Dr. Everett was summoned to meet John face to face. The tension in the room was palpable as the two men sized each other up. John spoke first, his voice measured but sharp. "Dr. Everett, I'd like to hear it from you directly. Why did you refuse to operate on me?" Dr. Everett hesitated, his usual confidence now replaced with unease. "Mr. Radcliffe, look, it wasn't personal. I just didn't feel comfortable proceeding with the surgery." "Comfortable?" John repeated, his voice calm but piercing. "I'm not asking for comfort, doctor. I'm asking for professionalism. You're one of the top surgeons in this hospital, or so I thought." Dr. Everett's jaw tightened. "With all due respect, Mr. Radcliffe, I have my principles, and I won't compromise them, no matter who the patient is." John leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto Dr. Everett's. "And what principle exactly did I violate by walking into your hospital? Wearing a hat you don't like? Expressing beliefs you don't agree with?" The room was silent, the weight of John's words hanging heavy in the air. "It wasn't about the hat," Dr. Everett said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's what it represents." John shook his head slowly, a faint smirk playing at his lips. "You know what I find ironic, doctor? You're so concerned about what my hat represents that you didn't even bother to see the man wearing it. You made an assumption about me, a biased, unprofessional assumption, And it's going to cost you. Dr. Everett's face flushed. Is that a threat? John smiled, though his eyes were cold. It's a promise. This hospital deserves better, and so do its patients. Juuta fallout beginshik. Dr. Keller intervened before the confrontation could escalate further. That's enough, she said firmly. Stepping between the two men. Mr. Radcliffe, we're committed to resolving this situation. And Dr. Everett, I suggest you start thinking very carefully about how you're going to make this right. As Dr. Everett stormed out of the room, John turned to Dr. Keller. I'll be watching closely, he said. Let's see how seriously this hospital takes its commitment to fairness and professionalism. By the next morning, the confrontation had leaked to the public. A staff member who had overheard the exchange in the hallway had recorded snippets of the discussion and sent them to a local news outlet. Within hours, the story spread like wildfire. Prominent surgeon refuses to treat patient over political beliefs, read one headline. Another, more sensationalized, screamed, hospital scandal. MAGA hat owner denied care by biased doctor. News crews descended on the hospital. Cameras stationed outside the entrance as reporters jostled for interviews. Social media exploded with opinions, hashtags trending across platforms. #healthcare bias and #justice for Radcliffe were among the most popular. While some users praised Dr. Everett for standing up for his principles, many more criticized his actions as unprofessional and discriminatory. John watched the coverage from his office, his expression unreadable. His assistant David leaned over, pointing at one particularly scathing tweet. Doctors should save lives, not play politics. Fire him now. You've got public opinion on your side, David said. The question is, how far do you want to push this? John leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. We'll give them a chance to handle it internally. For now, Dr. Everett feels the pressure inside the hospital. Dr. Everett's world was unraveling. Everywhere he went, he could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, some sympathetic, but most judgmental. A few brave nurses even whispered openly in the break room about how his actions were tarnishing the hospital's reputation. Did you hear he refused to operate just because of a hat? One nurse said, shaking her head. I thought he was better than that, another murmured. Dr. Everett tried to ignore them, but their words cut deeper than he cared to admit. His office phone rang constantly. Reporters looking for statements, hospital administrators asking for explanations, and worst of all, his wife demanding to know what he had done to get his name dragged through the mud. By midday, he was summoned to an emergency meeting with Dr. Keller and the hospital's legal team. Should the hospital respond? Dr. Everett, we're in crisis mode. Dr. Keller began, her tone sharp and unyielding. This situation has gone beyond just you and Mr. Radcliffe. It's about the integrity of this institution. I understand that, Dr. Everett said, though his voice carried more frustration than remorse. But I stand by my decision. I shouldn't be forced to treat someone whose values I fundamentally oppose. The head of legal, a no-nonsense man named Mr. Grant, leaned forward. That may be how you feel personally, doctor, but legally, this puts the hospital in a very precarious position. Refusing care based on political beliefs is a dangerous precedent to set. Dr. Everett's jaw tightened. I didn't refuse based on politics. It was, don't, Mr. Grant interrupted, raising a hand. Don't try to spin this. The optics are bad enough without you digging yourself a deeper hole. Dr. Keller folded her arms. We're issuing a public statement distancing the hospital from your actions. As for your position here, the board will be reviewing your case. What does that mean? Dr. Everett asked, though he already knew. It means your future at this hospital is on thin ice, Dr. Keller said. I suggest you start considering how to make amends before it's too late. John breaks his silent choke. Meanwhile, John decided it was time to address the public. Standing outside the hospital, flanked by David and his legal counsel, he spoke directly to the cameras. I didn't come to this hospital expecting special treatment, he began, his voice steady and composed. I came as a patient, trusting that the professionals here would provide the care I needed without prejudice. What I received instead was a lesson in how deeply personal biases can affect even the most respected institutions. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Let me be clear. This isn't just about me. It's about every patient who has ever felt judged, dismissed, or treated unfairly because of who they are or what they believe. That has no place in healthcare. The cameras flashed furiously as reporters shouted questions. Are you calling for Dr. Everett to be fired? One asked. John met the reporter's gaze. I'm calling for accountability. How the hospital handles this will speak volumes about its commitment to its patients and its principles. The press conference went viral almost immediately, with clips of John's calm yet powerful remarks spreading across platforms. The public outcry intensified, putting even more pressure on the hospital's leadership to act decisively. Dr. Everett's reckoning back in his office. Dr. Everett sat staring at his computer screen. His inbox was flooded with angry emails, some from complete strangers calling him everything from a bigot to a hero, others from professional organizations demanding explanations. He knew he had a choice to make: dig in his heels or try to repair the damage. Later that evening, he drafted a statement, though every word felt like a bitter pill to swallow. I regret the decision I made, it began, and I apologize to Mr. Radcliffe for any distress I caused. My actions were not reflective of the values I strive to uphold as a physician. He stopped typing, staring at the blinking cursor. Was this enough? Could an apology even begin to mend the damage? Here is an extended version of Yugen Section 5, the board's decision and the aftermath Yug, with additional detail, dialogue, and reflective moments. The boardroom was filled with tension as the clock ticked past 10 p.m. Dr. Everett, seated at the far end of the table, shifted uncomfortably under the piercing gazes of the hospital's leadership. The weight of his actions had become undeniably clear over the past week, but he still struggled with conflicting emotions, part defiance, part regret. Dr. Keller began the meeting with a stern tone. We've reviewed the situation from every angle. Dr. Everett's decision to refuse a patient based on personal bias has placed this hospital in a precarious position. The question now is how we move forward in a way that protects the integrity of this institution. One board member, a younger woman with a background in patient advocacy, spoke up. We can't afford to send a message that this kind of behavior is acceptable. What happens the next time a patient walks in wearing something controversial? Do we let personal beliefs dictate their care? Another member, a pragmatic older man, countered, but firing him outright could escalate the situation even further. There's already a segment of the public painting him as a hero for standing by his principles. We need to tread carefully. As the discussion grew more heated, Dr. Everett listened in silence, his jaw clenched. He was painfully aware that his career and reputation hung in the balance. Finally, he was given the floor. Rising from his seat, Dr. Everett took a deep breath. I've spent my entire career striving to be the best surgeon I can be, but I won't stand here and pretend I didn't fail in this instance. I let my personal beliefs influence my decision, and that was wrong. He paused, scanning the room. But I also believe that people can learn from their mistakes. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to prove that I can be better. Terminating me may satisfy the public in the short term, but it won't address the root of the problem. Let me help fix what I've broken. Let me help fix what I've broken. The room was silent for a moment, the board members exchanging thoughtful glances. Dr. Keller finally broke the silence. Thank you, Dr. Everett. Your statement will be taken into account as we deliberate. The decision wasn't made lightly. Hours of discussion led to a compromise that attempted to balance accountability with the possibility of redemption. The next day, Dr. Everett was summoned back to the boardroom, where Dr. Keller delivered the verdict. Dr. Everett, she began, after careful consideration, the board has decided to retain you under strict conditions. You will be placed on probation for 6 months, during which you'll complete intensive training in bias awareness and patient relations. Additionally, you'll participate in community outreach programs to rebuild trust. Failure to meet these expectations will result in immediate termination. Dr. Everett exhaled, relief and humility washing over him. Thank you. I won't waste this opportunity. Meanwhile, John Radcliffe sat in his office, reviewing the board's official decision. He wasn't entirely satisfied, but he saw the potential for real change in the outlined consequences. During a meeting with Dr. Keller, he expressed his thoughts candidly. Probation and training are fine, but words on paper mean nothing if they're not backed by action. I'll be watching this closely, and I expect results. Dr. Keller nodded. We are watching this closely, and I expect results. Dr. Keller nodded. You have my word, Mr. Radcliffe. This is only the beginning of our efforts to ensure nothing like this happens again. A week later, the hospital organized a press conference to address the controversy. John and Dr. Everett stood side by side, an unlikely pairing that symbolized the institution's effort to turn a scandal into a lesson. Dr. Everett spoke first, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. I want to start by apologizing to Mr. Radcliffe and to anyone who felt disrespected by my actions. As a doctor, my duty is to provide care without prejudice, and I failed to uphold that standard. I've reflected deeply on my mistakes, and I'm committed to making amends through both action and accountability. When it was John's turn to speak, his tone was calm but firm. This incident has shone a light on an issue that goes beyond one surgeon or one hospital. It's about the values we uphold as professionals and as human beings. I accept Dr. Everett's apology, but I'll be holding this institution accountable for following through on its commitments to change. The press conference received mixed reactions, but it marked a turning point in the public narrative. While some remained skeptical of Dr. Everett's sincerity, others viewed his willingness to apologize as a step in the right direction. Over the next 6 months, Dr. Everett immersed himself in the hospital's new training programs. He attended workshops on implicit bias, led by experts who challenged his assumptions and forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his actions. One of the most transformative experiences came during a community forum, where patients shared stories of feeling judged or mistreated by medical professionals. Dr. Everett listened intently, his usual confidence replaced by quiet humility. I never realized how much harm a single decision could cause, he admitted to a colleague afterward. This isn't just about me. It's about the culture we've created in this field. Under John's guidance, the hospital implemented sweeping reforms. New policies emphasized transparency, inclusivity, and patient-centered care. Staff members were required to complete annual bias training, and a patient advocacy council was established to address grievances directly. Dr. Everett became an active participant in these efforts, often volunteering to lead sessions on the lessons he had learned. While some colleagues viewed him with lingering skepticism, others admired his determination to grow and change. One evening, John walked through the hospital's bustling corridors, his presence now a familiar and reassuring sight to staff and patients alike. Passing Dr. Everett's office, he noticed the surgeon reviewing charts, his expression focused but lighter than it had been in months. For a moment, John considered stepping in to speak with him, but decided against it. Some battles didn't need to be refought. Instead, he smiled faintly to himself and continued down the hallway. The true measure of progress, he thought, isn't in words or apologies. It's in the actions we take to be better, and the trust we rebuild along the way.